The crisp morning sun stretched across the lot of Golden Ridge Motors, casting a golden hue over rows of freshly waxed cars. The sleek sedans and robust trucks gleamed like polished gems, each one a testament to the dealership's success. Inside the grand showroom, sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling glass walls, illuminating the immaculate tiles and the sales team poised for the day. Their sharp suits and carefully cultivated smiles were as much a part of the scene as the cars themselves, each handshake and pitch crafted to seal the deal and secure the highest profit. To the sales staff, it was just another bustling day. Customers wandered in, browsed, and occasionally stopped to chat with the charismatic salesman. Yet amidst the ordinary chaos, something extraordinary unfolded. A man who seemed to slip through the crowd like a shadow. Dressed in faded jeans and a well-worn flannel shirt, he could have been anyone. A middle-aged father looking for a reliable car, a local contractor needing a sturdy truck, or perhaps someone searching for their first big purchase. His relaxed posture and easy smile betrayed nothing. But this man, Nathan Hayes, wasn't just another customer. Unbeknownst to the staff, he was the owner of Golden Ridge Motors, the visionary behind its multi-state success. Years ago, Nathan started this business from nothing but grit and determination. Over time, the dealership grew into a thriving enterprise, earning a reputation for fair prices and dependable cars. Yet as the business expanded, Nathan felt himself growing distant from the heart of it all, the customers. Reports from his managers painted a rosy picture, but whispers of high-pressure tactics and questionable deals had reached his ears. He couldn't shake the nagging doubt that his business had strayed from the principles it was built on. That morning he decided to see for himself. No entourage, no announcement, just him walking in as any customer would. Nathan wandered the lot, occasionally trailing his hand along the cool metal of the cars. A salesman spotted him and approached with a confident grin. "Good morning, sir. Looking for anything in particular today?" Nathan tilted his head, playing his role perfectly. "Just browsing for something reliable, maybe a used sedan. Nothing too fancy." The salesman nodded eagerly. "You've come to the right place. Let me show you some of our best options." But as Nathan followed the man's polished pitch, his attention was drawn elsewhere. Years of experience had sharpened his ability to pick up on the smallest details. The nervous fidgeting of employees, the uneasy smiles of customers, the faint tension that seemed to hang in the air like a cloud. And then he heard it, a voice trembling and edged with desperation. "Please, there has to be something else you can do." Nathan's steps faltered. He turned his head toward the source of the plea. At a desk near the corner of the showroom, an elderly couple stood across from a salesman. The man, his posture stooped with age, clutched a worn leather cap in his hands. His wife stood beside him, her hand resting on his arm, her face lined with worry. Behind the desk sat Jordan Blake, the dealership's sales manager. His crisp suit and slicked-back hair made him look every bit the corporate man he was. "I'm sorry," Jordan said, his tone flat and dismissive. "This is the best I can do. That car isn't worth much." The woman's voice cracked. "But it was our son's car. He passed away last year. We've done everything we can to keep it, but we can't afford the repairs anymore." Nathan's chest tightened as he watched Jordan shrug indifferently. "Look, I understand it's sentimental, but sentimental value doesn't pay the bills. My offer is $2,000, and that's already generous." The woman dabbed at her eyes while her husband's grip on his cap tightened. Nathan clenched his fists. This wasn't just a bad deal, it was heartless. These weren't just customers. They were grieving parents trying to preserve a piece of their son's memory. Without hesitation, Nathan stepped forward. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm yet commanding. "What's going on here?" Jordan turned, his irritation evident. "Sir, this is a private matter." Nathan's expression remained neutral, but his eyes burned with quiet intensity. "I couldn't help overhearing. That sedan caught my eye. What's the trade-in value?" "It's not for sale," Jordan snapped, visibly annoyed. "It's being traded in?" Nathan raised an eyebrow. "And the offer?" Jordan hesitated before muttering, 2,000. Nathan crossed his arms, his voice steady but firm. "That's your best offer? I'll give them $5,000. The elderly couple looked at him in stunned silence, while Jordan's face flushed with anger. "You can't just—" Nathan cut him off, his tone unyielding. "We'll talk later, Jordan. Right now I'm handling this." Turning to the couple, he smiled gently. "Let's step outside and talk." As they walked away, the sunlight bathed the lot once more, and Nathan felt a surge of determination. He wasn't just here to buy a car. He was here to reclaim the heart of his business. As Nathan Hayes watched his company grow from a modest single-lot dealership into a sprawling chain spanning several states, something unexpected happened. The connection he once cherished with his business began to fade. The hustle and bustle of expansion had pulled him further from the day-to-day operations, leaving those details in the hands of his management team. Reports showed strong sales and satisfied customers, the spreadsheets painting a picture of success. Yet, beyond the comforting numbers, Nathan had started to hear whispers, complaints, faint but troubling like cracks forming in the foundation. Stories trickled in about pushy salesmen, unfair trade-in deals, and pricing practices that seemed less than transparent. On the surface, everything appeared fine, but Nathan had built this business from nothing. He knew numbers could lie, but people rarely did. A single dissatisfied voice could reveal truths that reports glossed over. That's why today, Nathan wasn't stepping into Golden Ridge Motors as its CEO. There would be no entourage, no welcoming committee, no office meetings. Instead, he walked the lot as just another face in the crowd. This wasn't merely an observation. He needed to feel the pulse of his business firsthand, to see how his employees treated people when they thought no one was watching. The morning sunlight gleamed off rows of meticulously polished cars. Nathan meandered between them, pausing every now and then to run his fingers along the smooth hoods. His worn jeans and plaid shirt allowed him to move unnoticed, blending in as someone who might be shopping for his first car or replacing an old reliable. The smell of fresh wax and the faint hum of voices filled the air as he absorbed the scene, noting every detail. A salesman spotted him and approached with a practiced smile, the kind designed to inspire trust and close deals. "Good morning, sir," he greeted, his voice warm but precise. "Looking for anything in particular today?" Nathan returned the smile with ease, slipping into his role. "Yeah, I'm in the market for something reliable. Maybe a used sedan, nothing fancy." The salesman nodded enthusiastically, his polished demeanor suggesting he'd done this 100 times. "We've got some great options. Let me show you a few that might be a perfect fit." Nathan followed, appearing to listen intently as the salesman launched into his pitch, showcasing the vehicle's reliability and features. Yet, Nathan's attention was split. Years of experience had sharpened his ability to pick up on the subtleties of human behavior. The stiff smiles of employees under pressure, the fidgeting of a customer unsure if they were making the right decision, and the faint tension that seemed to hang in the air like static before a storm. As they passed by the showroom's massive glass windows, Nathan's hand brushed against the cool metal of another car. The salesman's voice continued, polished and precise, but Nathan's mind wandered. He couldn't help but wonder how many customers had walked these aisles feeling uncertain or misled. How many of them had left with a vehicle but without the confidence that they'd been treated fairly. "Right here is one of our best deals," the salesman said, motioning to a car parked nearby. Nathan nodded, playing the role of a curious customer, but his focus wasn't on the car. It was on everything else: the tone, the energy, the unspoken truths in the space around him. He wasn't just here to buy a car. He was here to uncover the reality behind the numbers, to understand the unfiltered experiences of the people who stepped onto this lot every day. And as he moved through the showroom, blending into the crowd, Nathan felt the weight of his mission settle over him like a challenge he couldn't afford to ignore. This wasn't just about cars or sales, it was about trust. And trust, he knew, was the foundation of everything he'd built. As Nathan Hayes nodded along to the salesman's enthusiastic pitch about safety ratings and fuel efficiency, his attention was quietly drifting. Years of running his business had honed his instincts. He could sense when something wasn't right. The showroom was a symphony of calculated movements. Salesmen laughing too loudly at a hesitant joke, customers fidgeting under the weight of their decisions, whispers exchanged just out of earshot. Nathan knew to watch the spaces between the words, the unspoken moments that revealed the truth of his business. And then he heard it. A voice, low and trembling, cut through the hum of activity. "Please, isn't there anything else you can do?" Nathan's head turned slightly toward the sound, his gaze narrowing as it landed on an elderly couple at the trade-in desk. The man, tall but slightly hunched, rested a steadying hand on the counter. His silver hair was combed neatly, a quiet dignity emanating from his posture despite his age. Beside him, his wife gripped his hand tightly, her brow furrowed with worry. Her lips trembled as she stared at the man across from them, Rick Larson, the dealership's sales manager. Their car sat just outside the window, its once pristine paint dulled by time but still meticulously maintained. The older sedan seemed almost out of place among the shiny new models that surrounded it, like a relic from another era. Rick, with his perfectly tailored suit and air of practiced authority, leaned back in his chair, exuding an air of impatience. Nathan had seen Rick's type before. Managers who prided themselves on squeezing every last dollar out of a deal. His tone was brisk, void of empathy as he delivered his response. "I'm sorry," Rick said with a shrug that carried neither regret nor sincerity. "This is the best I can do. That car isn't worth much. Honestly, you're lucky I'm offering this." The woman's voice cracked as she tried again. "But, it's not just a car to us. It belonged to our son." Her words wavered and her husband's grip on her hand tightened. "He passed away last year. We've held on to it for as long as we could, but we just can't afford the repairs anymore." Nathan felt a sharp pang in his chest. He'd heard plenty of sad stories in his line of work, but the raw pain in the woman's voice made his stomach twist. This wasn't just about a car, it was about the memory of a loved one, the only tangible connection they had left. Rick didn't even blink. "I get it," he replied, his voice devoid of warmth. "I really do. But sentimental value doesn't add a dime to the market value. My offer stands, $2,000. And honestly, that's generous, given the mileage and wear." Nathan watched as the woman's lip quivered, a single tear slipping down her cheek. Her husband straightened his back, his jaw tightening as if willing himself to be strong for her. But Nathan could see it, the weight of years of grief, of a love stretched thin by circumstances beyond their control. Rick, however, was unmoved. He gestured dismissively toward the exit. "If you're not ready to move forward, I have other customers to assist." Nathan felt his blood pressure rise, his jaw tightening as anger flared within him. This wasn't just a bad deal, it was predatory. These people weren't just customers. They were grieving parents trying to preserve a piece of their son's legacy. And Rick's callousness was like salt in an open wound. Nathan stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Excuse me," he said, cutting through the tension like a blade. "What's going on here?" Rick turned, clearly annoyed at the interruption. "Sir, this is a private conversation." Nathan ignored him, addressing the couple instead. "I couldn't help overhearing. What's the trade-in value he's offering you?" The husband hesitated before muttering, 2,000. Nathan nodded thoughtfully, glancing at the car outside. "That's it? For a car in that condition?" Rick's face darkened. "It's an old model. That's more than fair." Nathan raised an eyebrow. "I'll give you $5,000. The room fell silent. The elderly couple stared at him, stunned, while Rick's expression shifted from annoyance to disbelief. "You can't just..." Nathan cut him off, his voice now laced with quiet authority. "We'll talk later, Rick." Then he turned back to the couple. "Let's step outside and discuss this." The woman looked up at him, her tear-filled eyes wide with gratitude. "Why would you do this for us?" Nathan smiled softly, his voice steady. "Because some things are worth more than money." Nathan Hayes pretended to inspect a nearby car, running his fingers along its polished surface, but his attention was fixed on the conversation unfolding just a few steps away. The elderly woman dabbed at her eyes with a trembling hand, her voice cracking as she pleaded, "But this car belonged to our son. He passed away last year." Her husband stood beside her, his stoic expression betraying the weight he carried. "We kept it as long as we could," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "But we just can't afford the repairs anymore." Nathan's chest tightened as he took in the scene. The couple's grief hung in the air like a heavy fog, yet the sales manager, Rick Larson, stood before them unmoved. Nathan recognized the type, a man who saw every interaction as a transaction, every emotion as an obstacle to his bottom line. Rick let out an exaggerated sigh, crossing his arms as he delivered his response with calculated indifference. "Listen, I get it. I really do," he said, his tone implying the exact opposite. "But sentimental value doesn't add dollars to an appraisal. The market price is the market price." The woman's lower lip quivered, and Nathan could see the strength draining from her as she held onto her husband's arm for support. "It's not just a car to us," she said, her voice trembling with raw emotion. "It's the last piece of him we have left." Her husband's grip on her hand tightened, his jaw clenched as he struggled to maintain his composure. Though he stood tall, his shoulders sagged under the weight of his wife's pain, the financial burden, and the memory of their son. But Rick didn't flinch. If anything, he seemed bored, as though their anguish was a tedious interruption to his day. "The offer stands at $2,000, he said flatly, with an air of finality. "That's already generous, considering the mileage and wear. If you want to move forward, we can do the paperwork now. Otherwise..." He gestured toward the door with a dismissive wave. Nathan felt a surge of anger rush through him, his blood pounding in his ears. This wasn't just a matter of poor customer service, It was cruel. The way Rick treated the couple wasn't merely unkind, it was predatory, targeting people at their most vulnerable and dismissing their humanity. Unable to stand by any longer, Nathan stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. "Excuse me," he said, breaking the tense silence. "What's going on here?" Rick turned to him, his irritation evident. "Sir, this is a private discussion," he said curtly, clearly unprepared for an interruption. Nathan ignored him, focusing instead on the couple. His gaze softened as he addressed them directly. "I couldn't help overhearing," he said. "What's the trade-in value he's offering you?" The husband hesitated for a moment, glancing at Rick before responding. $2,000, he said quietly, his voice heavy with resignation. Nathan nodded, casting a quick glance at the car outside. It was old, sure, but it was in good shape for its age, clean, cared for, loved. "That's it?" he asked, his tone carrying a quiet disbelief. "For a car in that condition?" Rick bristled, his face darkening. "It's an older model, high mileage." "That's more than fair." Nathan turned back to the couple, his expression resolute. "I'll offer you $5,000, he said without hesitation. The room went silent. The couple stared at him, their eyes wide with shock, while Rick's face twisted in a mix of outrage and confusion. "You can't just," Rick began, but Nathan cut him off with a sharp glance. "We'll talk later, Rick," Nathan said firmly, leaving no room for argument. He turned his attention back to the couple. "Let's step outside and talk privately." The woman's eyes filled with tears, and her husband's stoic demeanor cracked just enough to reveal his gratitude. "Why would you do this for us?" the woman asked, her voice trembling with disbelief. Nathan smiled softly, his voice calm and steady. "Because some things are worth more than money." As he led the couple toward the door, Nathan could feel Rick's glare burning into his back. But he didn't care. This wasn't about Rick or even the dealership, it was about doing the right thing for two people who had already lost too much. Rick turned, his face a mask of irritation as he met Nathan Hayes' calm gaze. "Sir, this is a private discussion," Rick said, his tone sharp and dismissive. Nathan's expression remained neutral, his voice even. "I apologize for intruding, but I couldn't help overhearing. I'm actually in the market for a car myself, and that sedan outside caught my eye." The elderly couple turned to Nathan, their surprise evident. The man's grip on his wife's hand tightened slightly as if unsure whether the stranger's interest was genuine. Meanwhile, Rick's eyes narrowed, clearly frustrated by the interruption. "It's not for sale," Rick snapped. "It's being traded in?" Nathan raised a hand to his chin, feigning deep thought. "I see," he said slowly. "But I might be interested in buying it directly." "What's the trade-in value you're offering?" Rick hesitated, his irritation flickering into something more defensive. $2,000, he muttered, his voice clipped. Nathan's eyebrows shot up. "That's it?" he asked, his tone laced with disbelief. "For a car in that condition?" Rick's expression darkened, and he crossed his arms. "It's an old model with high mileage." "That's a generous offer." Nathan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a long, deliberate breath, letting the silence hang in the air. Then, as if coming to a decision, he said, "I'll offer $5,000. The room fell into stunned silence. The elderly couple gasped, their faces a mixture of astonishment and confusion. "Oh no, we couldn't," the woman stammered, shaking her head as though the very idea was too generous to accept. Nathan raised a hand gently, cutting off their protest. "Let's talk outside," he said, his voice kind but firm. "Away from the crowd?" The couple exchanged a hesitant glance before nodding. As Nathan led them toward the door, he could feel Rick's seething glare following him. Once outside, the noise of the showroom faded, leaving only the hum of passing cars and the soft crunch of gravel underfoot. "Why would you do this for us?" the woman asked, her voice trembling as she clutched her husband's arm. Her eyes were filled with uncertainty, as though she was bracing herself for another disappointment. Nathan turned to them, his gaze steady and sincere. "Because I can see this car means more to you than just transportation. Tell me the story. What makes it so important?" The woman's lips quivered, and for a moment she couldn't speak. Her husband stepped in, his voice heavy with emotion. "It was our son's car," he began, his words slow and deliberate. "He was a firefighter, a hero in our community. This car was his pride and joy. After he passed away in the line of duty, we kept it as a way to hold on to him." The woman nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "We've done everything we could to maintain it, but with medical bills and our own health problems," her voice broke. "We just can't afford it anymore." Nathan's chest tightened as he listened, the weight of their story settling heavily on his shoulders. This wasn't just a car, It was a lifeline to their son's memory, a connection they were being forced to sever out of necessity. Nathan met their eyes, his voice calm and resolute. "I'll buy the car from you not as a trade-in but for its full value. And I promise
The
you
woman
this,
let out a
it won't
soft,
end up on a used car
gasp.
lot." Her hands
"I'll
flying
restore
to
it
her
and
mouth.
keep it in his memory."
"You would do that?" she whispered. Nathan nodded, pulling a checkbook from his pocket. "Some things are worth more than money. Your son's legacy is one of them." The man's voice cracked as he extended a trembling hand. "Thank you. I don't know how to thank you enough." Nathan shook his hand firmly, a small, reassuring smile on his face. "You just did." As the couple walked away, Nathan watched them with a mixture of satisfaction and determination. This wasn't just about doing the right thing for them, it was about something bigger. It was about remembering why he started this business in the first place. To treat people with dignity, to make their lives better, and to honor the values that truly matter. Nathan Hayes listened carefully as Harold and Linda shared their story, the weight of their words settling deep in his chest. Their son's car wasn't just a vehicle, it was a bridge to memories, a tangible reminder of a life well lived and tragically lost. But time and financial pressures had left them no choice but to part with it for something more practical. Nathan nodded thoughtfully, his resolve solidifying. "I'll buy the car from you," he said softly, "but not as a trade-in." Harold's brow furrowed in confusion. "Then why would you do that?" he asked, his voice tinged with both gratitude and suspicion. Nathan smiled, a genuine warmth behind his words. "Because I don't want it to end up on a resale lot. I'll restore it and keep it in his memory." Linda's eyes filled with tears, her voice breaking as she asked, "You would do that? For us?" Nathan reached into his pocket, retrieving his checkbook with deliberate care. As he began writing, he spoke with a quiet conviction. "It's not just a car," he said, his gaze steady on them. "It's a legacy." He tore the check from the book and handed it to Harold, who stared at it in disbelief. Before the older man could muster a response, the showroom doors slammed open and Rick Larson stormed out. His face was flushed with anger, his movements sharp and aggressive. "You can't just," Rick started, his voice rising in outrage. Nathan turned to him, his expression unreadable but commanding in its stillness. His voice was calm but carried a sharp edge. "We'll talk later, Rick," he said, his tone leaving no room for debate. "A long conversation about how you run things here." Rick froze, his bravado faltering. Something about Nathan's tone, the weight behind his words, sent a ripple of unease through him. For the first time, he seemed to sense that he wasn't dealing with an ordinary customer. His mouth opened slightly as though to protest, but no words came. The tension was palpable as Nathan stood there, the check still firm in his grip, flanked by Harold and Linda. The couple looked at him as though he had just performed a miracle. Their eyes, lined with the weight of years and loss, now glistened with something fragile and rare, hope. We don't know how to thank you," Harold stammered, his voice thick with emotion. He held his wife's hand tighter, his other hand trembling as it held the check. Nathan smiled softly, the kind of smile that reassured rather than overwhelmed. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "Just keep his memory alive. That's all I ask." Linda stepped closer, her voice barely a whisper. "People don't do things like this anymore," she said, her tearful gaze locking onto Nathan's. "You've given us more than just money. You've given us peace." Nathan nodded, his own throat tightening. He extended his hand and Harold shook it firmly, his grip speaking volumes. As the couple turned to leave, their steps lighter than before, Nathan watched them, a deep sense of purpose settling over him. Rick stood off to the side, his expression a mix of frustration and confusion. He opened his mouth again but Nathan didn't acknowledge him. Instead, Nathan let his focus remain on Harold and Linda as they walked toward their car, the vehicle that had carried their son's dreams and now, a part of his legacy. This wasn't just about a single act of kindness. It was a reckoning, a moment that demanded change, not just for the couple but for the business Nathan had built and the values it represented. And as Rick shifted uncomfortably beside him, Nathan knew that change was coming whether Rick liked it or not. Harold's voice was soft, barely above a murmur as he gripped his wife's hand tightly. "I don't know what to say," he said, his words thick with emotion. "No one's ever done something like this for us." Linda wiped at her tears, her gaze fixed on Nathan Hayes with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "You don't even know us," she whispered. "Why would you do this?" Nathan smiled warmly, a quiet kindness radiating from him. "Because some things are more important than money," he said simply. Turning toward the sedan parked nearby, he ran his fingers over its hood, his touch deliberate and thoughtful. "This car meant something to your son and it means something to you. I don't believe in taking advantage of people just because business says I should. Harold swallowed hard, his voice thick with emotion as he nodded. He would have liked you, he said, the words carrying a heavy weight of meaning. Nathan felt his chest tighten, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him like a tangible force. The compliment, simple as it was, struck him deeply. It wasn't just about Harold's son, it was about the principles Nathan had built his business on. Was this how his employees saw him? Did his dealership still stand for fairness and respect, or had it become just another corporate machine, preying on people like Harold and Linda? Before he could dwell on the thought, the sharp slam of the glass showroom doors shattered the quiet moment. Nathan turned to see Rick Larson storming out, his face flushed red with anger. His movements were quick and aggressive, his frustration written in every line of his body. I need a word with you, Rick barked, ignoring Harold and Linda entirely. His tone was sharp, demanding, as though he still held authority in the situation. Right now. Nathan exhaled slowly, refusing to be rushed or ruffled by Rick's outburst. Without a word, he slipped the check into Harold's hand, making sure it was secure before turning to face Rick fully. The shift in Nathan's demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. His calm, composed exterior now carried an edge of quiet power, a reminder of who he was and the authority he held. Harold and Linda stood silently, their gratitude and confusion etched on their faces, as Rick's anger burned in the background. Nathan's steady gaze met Rick's fiery one, and for a moment, the air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken tension. We'll talk, Nathan said evenly, his voice low but resolute, but not here. And not now. Rick froze, his confidence faltering for the briefest moment. There was something in Nathan's tone, an unshakable command, a certainty that made it clear he wasn't a man to be challenged lightly. Rick's bravado wavered, and for the first time, a flicker of unease crossed his face. He didn't yet realize who he was truly dealing with, but the balance of power had undeniably shifted. Nathan turned back to Harold and Linda, his expression softening as he gestured toward their car. Take your time, he said gently. Drive it home when you're ready and know that it's staying in the family. Harold nodded, his voice trembling as he said, thank you for everything. Linda's tears fell freely now, her hand clutching her husband's as they turned to leave. Nathan watched them go, a quiet satisfaction settling over him. This moment wasn't just about righting a wrong for Harold and Linda, it was about confronting the deeper flaws in his business. As Rick shifted uncomfortably beside him, Nathan knew that their conversation, when it happened, wouldn't just be about one bad trade-in deal. It would be about the very soul of the dealership and the values it stood for, or failed to. The weight of the challenge ahead pressed on Nathan, but he welcomed it. Some things were more important than money, and today had reminded him of exactly what those things were. Nathan placed the check firmly into Harold's hands, his voice steady but warm. Take this, he said quietly, his words carrying a weight of finality. Drive your son's car home with pride. Harold hesitated for a moment, looking down at the check, his emotions clearly warring within him. Finally he nodded, gripping Nathan's hand firmly. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with gratitude. Linda, standing beside him, gave Nathan a tearful smile as they turned to leave, their steps lighter with each passing moment. Nathan watched them go, his expression resolute. He'd done the right thing, but the moment was far from over. Behind him, the sound of quick, angry footsteps broke through the quiet hum of the lot. Rick Larson stormed up, his face a furious shade of red, his movements jerky and aggressive. The smell of his cheap cologne, paired with the palpable stench of desperation, filled the space between them. What the hell do you think you're doing? Rick snarled, his voice rising as he stepped closer. Nathan turned to face him, his calm demeanor unshaken by Rick's outburst. Helping a customer, he said simply. Isn't that what we're supposed to do? Rick scoffed, his anger flaring further. That's not how this works, he snapped, crossing his arms tightly over his chest. His voice dropped, but the venom in his tone was unmistakable. You just cost this dealership thousands of dollars. And worse, you undermined my authority. Nathan arched an eyebrow, his gaze sharp. Authority? He repeated, his voice laced with quiet disdain. I didn't realize your job was to squeeze every last dime out of grieving parents. Rick's eyes flashed dangerously, his composure unraveling. He stepped closer, his posture aggressive. Look, I don't know who you think you are, he spat, his tone dripping with indignation. Nathan didn't flinch. Instead, he repeated the words, his voice shifting, steely, commanding, and undeniable. Who I think I am? He took a deliberate step forward, closing the distance between them. His entire demeanor shifted, his calm authority now carrying the unmistakable weight of power. For the first time, Rick hesitated, his bluster faltering as Nathan stared him down. "I own this dealership," Nathan said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The words landed with the force of a bomb. Rick's face went slack, his bravado melting into shock. His lips parted as he blinked rapidly, clearly struggling to process the revelation. "What?" he stammered, the word barely audible. Nathan didn't break eye contact. "I built this business from the ground up," he continued, his tone unwavering. "And I've spent years trusting people like you to uphold the values it was founded on." Clearly that trust was misplaced. Rick's mouth opened and closed as he searched for a response, but nothing came. The weight of Nathan's presence and the truth of his authority pressed down on him like an immovable force. Nathan's voice softened slightly, but his words carried no less weight. "Your behavior today wasn't just bad business, it was disgraceful. That couple deserved compassion and fairness, and instead, you offered them greed." Around them, employees had stopped pretending not to listen. Conversations trailed off, heads turned, and a palpable tension filled the air. The silent audience only seemed to amplify Rick's discomfort, his posture wilting under the collective gaze. Nathan took one last step closer, his voice dropping to a cold, quiet tone that left no room for argument. "We'll have a longer conversation soon, Rick. But make no mistake, this is the end of business as usual." Rick swallowed hard, his face pale, and for the first time he seemed to grasp the precariousness of his position. Without another word, Nathan turned and walked back toward the showroom, his shoulders square and his resolve unshakable. The message was clear. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was the beginning of a reckoning. Rick's face twisted into a mixture of disbelief and panic, his mouth opening and closing slightly, as though his brain were struggling to process the bombshell revelation. Finally he managed to choke out, "What?" Nathan Hayes reached into his pocket with deliberate calm, pulling out a business card. Holding it up between two fingers, the name and logo of Golden Ridge Motors gleamed under the light. His voice was sharp as a blade as he said, "I'm Nathan Hayes, the owner. The man who built this company from nothing." The words sliced through the air like a thunderclap. Rick's entire body went rigid, his face draining of color. Every employee within earshot froze in place. Some subtly leaned closer, pretending to work as they eagerly listened. A few exchanged furtive glances, smirks creeping across their faces as though they'd been waiting for Rick to face a reckoning. Nathan's eyes locked onto Rick's with an unflinching intensity. "And I just watched you disrespect two grieving parents, lie about the value of their car, and treat this dealership like a scam operation." The silence that followed was deafening. Rick stammered, his words a jumbled mess of excuses. I didn't know who you were." Nathan raised an eyebrow, his expression colder than Rick had ever seen. "You didn't know who I was, so you thought it was okay?" he said, his voice low but brimming with controlled anger. Rick broke into a nervous sweat, tugging at his collar as though it had suddenly become too tight. "Listen, Mr. Hayes, I was just doing my job. Maximizing profits for the dealership like we're supposed to." Nathan's jaw tightened, his voice cutting through Rick's excuses like a blade. "Maximizing profits?" he repeated, his tone dripping with disdain. "By taking advantage of people who walked in here trusting us to treat them fairly? By exploiting a family still grieving their son? That's not a business model, it's predation." Rick's posture wilted further under Nathan's glare. Around them, employees exchanged looks of quiet vindication. Some appeared relieved, as if Nathan's words were lifting a weight they'd silently carried. Others stood motionless, clearly aware that this confrontation marked a turning point. Nathan took a step closer, his voice calm but relentless. "If I were just another customer, you wouldn't have thought twice about squeezing every last dime out of those people. That's the real problem here. Not that you didn't know who I was, but that you don't see why this is wrong." Rick opened his mouth to protest but stopped, the words dying on his tongue. The weight of Nathan's presence, his authority, and his unwavering gaze was too much to counter. Nathan took a deep breath, his voice dropping to a tone that carried not just authority but finality. "This dealership is supposed to stand for something more than just profits. Fairness, honesty, respect. Those values built this company and earned the trust of every customer who's walked through those doors. And you," he pointed a finger at Rick. "You've turned it into something I don't recognize." Rick's shoulders slumped and his gaze dropped to the floor, his facade of confidence now completely shattered. Nathan straightened, looking around at the employees who had gathered, their eyes wide with anticipation. Let me make something clear, Nathan said, his voice carrying across the room. What I saw today will not happen again, not here, not anywhere in my company. If anyone thinks they can operate like this and still keep their job, they're mistaken. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the showroom lights. Then, slowly, heads nodded in quiet agreement. Some employees looked cautiously hopeful, while others wore expressions of quiet determination. Nathan turned back to Rick, his voice once again quiet but firm. We'll finish this conversation in my office. And after that, we'll decide if you have any place in this company at all. Nathan didn't break eye contact. I built this business from the ground up, he continued, his tone unwavering. And I've spent years trusting people like you to uphold the values it was founded on. Clearly that trust was misplaced. Rick's mouth opened and closed as he searched for a response, but nothing came. The weight of Nathan's presence and the truth of his authority pressed down on him like an immovable force. Nathan's voice softened slightly, but his words carried no less weight. Your behavior today wasn't just bad business, it was disgraceful. That couple deserved compassion and fairness, and instead, you offered them greed. Around them, employees had stopped pretending not to listen. Conversations trailed off, heads turned, and a palpable tension filled the air. The silent audience only seemed to amplify Rick's discomfort, his posture wilting under the collective gaze. Nathan took one last step closer, his voice dropping to a cold, quiet tone that left no room for argument. We'll have a longer conversation soon, Rick. But make no mistake, this is the end of business as usual. Rick swallowed hard, his face pale, and for the first time he seemed to grasp the precariousness of his position. Without another word, Nathan turned and walked back toward the showroom, his shoulders square and his resolve unshakable. The message was clear. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was the beginning of a reckoning. Rick's face twisted into a mixture of disbelief and panic, his mouth opening and closing slightly, as though his brain were struggling to process the bombshell revelation. Finally he managed to choke out, What? Nathan Hayes reached into his pocket with deliberate calm, pulling out a business card. Holding it up between two fingers, the name and logo of Golden Ridge Motors gleamed under the light. His voice was sharp as a blade as he said, I'm Nathan Hayes, the owner. The man who built this company from nothing. The words sliced through the air like a thunderclap. Rick's entire body went rigid, his face draining of color. Every employee within earshot froze in place. Some subtly leaned closer, pretending to work as they eagerly listened. A few exchanged furtive glances, smirks creeping across their faces as though they'd been waiting for Rick to face a reckoning. Nathan's eyes locked onto Rick's with an unflinching intensity. And I just watched you disrespect two grieving parents, lie about the value of their car, and treat this dealership like a scam operation. The silence that followed was deafening. Rick stammered, his words a jumbled mess of excuses. I didn't know. I didn't know who you were. Nathan raised an eyebrow, his expression colder than Rick had ever seen. You didn't know who I was, so you thought it was okay? He said, his voice low but brimming with controlled anger. Rick broke into a nervous sweat, tugging at his collar as though it had suddenly become too tight. Listen, Mr. Hayes, I was just doing my job. Maximizing profits for the dealership like we're supposed to. Nathan's jaw tightened, his voice cutting through Rick's excuses like a blade. Maximizing profits? He repeated, his tone dripping with disdain. By taking advantage of people who walked in here trusting us to treat them fairly? By exploiting a family still grieving their son? That's not a business model, it's predation. Rick's posture wilted further under Nathan's glare. Around them, employees exchanged looks of quiet vindication. Some appeared relieved, as if Nathan's words were lifting a weight they'd silently carried. Others stood motionless, clearly aware that this confrontation marked a turning point. Nathan took a step closer, his voice calm but relentless. If I were just another customer, you wouldn't have thought twice about squeezing every last dime out of those people. That's the real problem here. Not that you didn't know who I was, but that you don't see why this is wrong. Rick opened his mouth to protest but stopped, the words dying on his tongue. The weight of Nathan's presence, his authority, and his unwavering gaze was too much to counter. Nathan took a deep breath, his voice dropping to a tone that carried not just authority but finality. This dealership is supposed to stand for something more than just profits. Fairness, honesty, respect. Those values built this company and earned the trust of every customer who's walked through those doors. And you, he pointed a finger at Rick. You've turned it into something I don't recognize. Rick's shoulders slumped and his gaze dropped to the floor, his facade of confidence now completely shattered. Nathan straightened, looking around at the employees who had gathered, their eyes wide with anticipation. "Let me make something clear," Nathan said, his voice carrying across the room. "What I saw today will not happen again, not here, not anywhere in my company. If anyone thinks they can operate like this and still keep their job, they're mistaken." The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the showroom lights. Then, slowly, heads nodded in quiet agreement. Some employees looked cautiously hopeful, while others wore expressions of quiet determination. Nathan turned back to Rick, his voice once again quiet but firm. "We'll finish this conversation in my office. And after that, we'll decide if you have any place in this company at all." Nathan's sharp eyes flicked to Rick, watching as the manager's complexion turned ashen. Rick's face betrayed his panic even before he blurted out, "That's a lie." Nathan didn't flinch. Instead, his piercing gaze locked onto Rick. "Is it?" he asked, his tone calm but cutting, each word heavy with unspoken meaning. Rick's silence was all the confirmation Nathan needed. The room seemed to hold its breath as the employees shifted uneasily, some looking guilty, others relieved that the truth was finally surfacing. Nathan could feel the energy change, the weight of suppressed frustration giving way to an unspoken hope. This wasn't just about Rick, Nathan realized. It was about a broken culture, a system that rewarded dishonesty and punished integrity. A line had been drawn, and now it was time to decide which side the dealership would stand on. Nathan exhaled slowly, his decision clear. He met Rick's panicked gaze with an unyielding resolve. "You're fired," he said, his voice calm but absolute. Rick's head snapped up in disbelief. "What?" he stammered, his voice laced with indignation. Nathan didn't raise his voice, but the finality in his tone was unmistakable. "Get your things and leave. Now." For a moment, Rick looked as though he might argue. His mouth opened, but as his eyes met Nathan's unrelenting stare, the fight drained out of him. He knew there was no point. With a muttered string of curses, he yanked his jacket off the back of his chair and stormed out of the room, his footsteps echoing through the now silent showroom. The employees didn't even pretend to be upset. Instead, they stood quietly, their faces reflecting a mix of relief and cautious optimism. Nathan turned to address them, his voice steady but charged with purpose. "From this moment on, things will be different," he said, his gaze sweeping the room. "This dealership, and every dealership with my name on it, will stand for honesty, respect, and fairness. If anyone here has a problem with that, you're free to leave right now." No one moved. Instead, a ripple of unspoken agreement passed through the group. Chris, still standing near the edge of the room, met Nathan's gaze and nodded subtly, his expression one of cautious hope. Nathan nodded back, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. This was only the beginning, but it was a start. The culture of greed and exploitation that had crept into his business wouldn't be easy to uproot, but Nathan was ready for the fight. This wasn't just about firing one bad manager, it was about reclaiming the values that had built his company and ensuring they were never compromised again. Nathan Hayes stood tall in the center of the showroom, his eyes fixed on the glass doors that had just swung shut behind Rick Larson. The defeated manager's stomping footsteps still echoed faintly, like the final notes of a song that had long overstayed its welcome. The tension in the air was thick, palpable as the employees exchanged glances, some nervous, some relieved, and others cautiously hopeful. Chris, the young salesman who had dared to speak up, stood straighter than before, his expression a mixture of gratitude and resolve. Around him, the team shifted uneasily, unsure of what Nathan's decisive actions meant for their futures. Nathan turned slowly, his sharp gaze sweeping the room. He had just made one of the most significant decisions of his career, firing a man whose behavior had poisoned the culture of the dealership. But he knew this moment wasn't about Rick, it was about everything the dealership had come to represent and the path forward. Deep down, Nathan understood this wasn't the end of the problem. It was just the beginning of the solution. Taking a deep breath, he addressed the room, his voice steady and firm. "From this moment on, things change," he said, his words cutting through the silence like a blade. "Customers come first. Fair deals, honest pricing, full transparency. That's the standard we're going to uphold, no exceptions." He let the statement hang in the air, the weight of it pressing down on everyone. Then his gaze hardened. "If anyone has a problem with that, now's the time to leave." The room was deathly quiet. No one moved. Some employees exchanged uncertain glances, but the underlying current was clear. No one was going anywhere. A quiet resolve began to ripple through the group, a subtle but significant shift. Chris stepped forward again, his voice steady but sincere. "Thank you, sir," he said, meeting Nathan's gaze directly. "For listening. For standing up for what's right." Nathan gave a small nod, acknowledging the courage it had taken for Chris to speak out. "Let's rebuild this place the right way," he said, his tone carrying both challenge and encouragement. As Rick stomped away into the parking lot, his figure growing smaller with each angry step, Nathan allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. There was a finality in Rick's departure, a sense of cleansing that came with removing a corrupt influence. But Nathan knew better than to think one act alone would fix everything. This wasn't just a business decision, it was the beginning of a revolution. He turned his attention back to the employees, his voice softer now but no less determined. "I know change isn't easy," he said. "And I know some of you might be worried about what this means for you. But I promise you this, if we do things the right way, the honest way, we'll not only survive, we'll thrive." The employees watched him carefully, some nodding subtly, others still processing the shift. But the unease that had once permeated the room began to lift, replaced by the faint stirrings of hope. Nathan straightened his shoulders, his resolve solidified. This was his business, his name on the building, and he would make sure it stood for integrity, respect, and fairness. For too long, the dealership had strayed from those values, but today marked a turning point. As the employees began to disperse, returning to their stations with a renewed sense of purpose, Nathan remained in the center of the room for a moment longer. The air felt different now, lighter yet charged with potential. He had taken the first step, but there was still much work to be done. With one last glance at the door where Rick had disappeared, Nathan turned and walked toward his office. The revolution had begun, and Nathan Hayes was ready to lead it. Nathan Hayes let the silence linger in the air, heavy and unbroken, as the weight of his words settled over the room. The employees stood motionless, their expressions a mix of apprehension and curiosity. Nathan's voice, firm but calm, cut through the tension like a steadying hand. "Let me be clear about something," he said, his gaze sweeping across the gathered employees. "This isn't just about firing one man. This is about fixing what's broken. If you've been following the same dishonest practices, that stops today." The room remained silent, a charged stillness that spoke volumes. A middle-aged salesman, Tim, shifted uncomfortably before clearing his throat. His voice was hesitant but respectful as he said, "Sir, with all due respect, Rick trained us to work this way." It wasn't just him, it was the system. Nathan nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth in Tim's words. "And that's exactly what I plan to change," he said, his voice steady but resolute. A murmur rippled through the staff, quiet but undeniable. Some employees exchanged uneasy glances, while others looked cautiously hopeful. Many had been working here for years, trapped in a culture where deception was rewarded, and integrity was punished. Could Nathan really mean it? Could things truly change? "What happens now?" another employee asked hesitantly, their voice breaking the collective silence. Nathan took a deep breath, his posture relaxed but his determination clear. "Now we clean house," he said. "We're starting fresh." By noon, Nathan had gathered every employee into the dealership's staff lounge. The space, usually buzzing with idle chatter, was unusually quiet. Papers rustled, coffee machines hummed, and the weight of uncertainty hung heavily in the air. Some employees sat with nervous fidgeting, while others leaned against the walls, their expressions ranging from skeptical to curious. Nathan stood at the head of the room, leaning against the table with a calm but authoritative presence. His gaze moved across the group, ensuring he had their full attention before speaking. "I know many of you are worried," he began. "And I don't blame you. For too long, this place has been run in a way that rewards cutting corners and preying on customers' trust. That ends today." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "From now on, we operate with fairness, transparency, and integrity. No more pressuring customers into deals they don't understand. No more hidden fees or inflated prices. We're going to do things the right way, and I promise you if we stick to this, we'll not only survive, we'll thrive." The room was quiet, but Nathan could see the gears turning in people's minds. Tim, the older salesman, raised a hand hesitantly. "Sir, I hear you and I respect what you're saying. But what about us? We've been trained to work a certain way. If we stop doing things the way Rick taught us, how do we keep our jobs? How do we make a living?" Nathan nodded, appreciating the honesty of the question. "That's fair," he said. "I'm not just asking you to change overnight. We'll implement new training, new systems that reward honesty and customer satisfaction, not just sales volume. You'll still earn commissions, but they'll be tied to how well you serve our customers, not how much you can squeeze out of them." A ripple of surprise moved through the room. The idea of tying commissions to customer satisfaction was unheard of in this dealership, and for many, it was a radical but intriguing concept. This is about building trust, Nathan continued. Not just with our customers but with each other. If you're willing to step up and be part of that change, I'll support you every step of the way. But if you're not, if you think the old way is the only way, I won't stop you from walking out that door. He paused, his eyes scanning the room. No one moved. Chris, the young salesman who had spoken up earlier, stepped forward again. I think I speak for a lot of us when I say, thank you, he said. It's been hard working here, knowing we were doing things that didn't feel right. It's good to know that's changing. Nathan gave a small nod, a faint smile breaking through his serious expression. Let's rebuild this place the right way, he said. Together. The employees began to nod, one by one, a sense of cautious optimism filling the room. Nathan could see it now, a spark of hope, a chance for redemption. This was just the beginning, but for the first time in a long time, the future felt like something worth fighting for. Nathan Hayes stood before his gathered employees, not as a distant CEO delivering a sanitized corporate message, but as someone who had just witnessed the raw reality of their daily struggles. His eyes moved across the room, meeting the uneasy gazes of his team, his voice calm but commanding. I know what some of you are thinking, he began, his words deliberate and measured. You're wondering if this is just another corporate speech. Another "we're making changes" talk that ends with nothing actually happening. A few employees exchanged glances, their skepticism written plainly on their faces. Nathan noticed the tension, the weariness of a workforce that had likely heard empty promises before. He didn't flinch. I'm here to tell you that this time it's real, he continued, his voice firm with conviction. We're not just changing a few policies. We're changing the way we do business, starting now. A few skeptical chuckles broke the silence, and one employee muttered just loud enough to be heard, "Sure, until corporate gets involved." Nathan smirked, his demeanor relaxed but resolute. I think I've got enough pull to make this happen, he said dryly. And if you're still not convinced, just remember, I fired your boss in front of all of you. That shut them up. The murmurs died down, replaced by a growing sense of intrigue. Nathan had their attention now. Chris, the young salesman who had spoken up earlier, leaned forward in his seat, his expression earnest. So, what does this mean for us? He asked, his voice tinged with both curiosity and apprehension. Nathan folded his arms across his chest, his stance confident but approachable. It means every single sale from now on will be transparent, he said. No more hidden fees. No more forced add-ons. And no more preying on customers who don't know better. A low murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Some employees nodded subtly, while others seemed to process the weight of what he was saying. For many, it was a radical shift from the way they had been trained to operate. Tim, the older salesman who had raised concerns earlier, let out a sigh. Sir, he began cautiously, I've been doing this for a long time. I've seen a lot of changes come and go. What makes this different? How do we make this work without losing our edge? Nathan turned to him, his gaze steady. We make it work because we're building something better, he said. Something customers can trust. People want to buy from someone they believe in, someone who treats them with respect. That's our edge. He paused, scanning the room once more. Look, I'm not saying it'll be easy, he admitted. But if we do this right, if we earn back the trust of our customers, this dealership will thrive. Not because we're the cheapest or the slickest, but because we're the most honest. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of his words settling over the employees. Then, slowly, a few heads nodded. Chris, ever the first to step forward, said, I'm in. Tim hesitated, then nodded as well, his expression thoughtful. It'll be a challenge, he said, but maybe it's what we need. Nathan allowed himself a small smile. The energy in the room was shifting, the skepticism giving way to cautious optimism. He could feel the spark of something new, a chance to rebuild, to restore not just the business but the pride of the people who worked there. Let's get to work, Nathan said, his voice steady and determined. This is just the beginning. And with that, the room began to hum with a quiet, renewed purpose. Nathan knew the road ahead would be long, but for the first time in years, it felt like the dealership, and its people, were heading in the right direction. Tim, the older salesman, spoke up, his voice hesitant but steady. Sir, I agree with you, he began, glancing around the room. But you have to understand something, some of us have families to feed. We've been making money the way we were trained to. If we suddenly stop, how do we survive? Nathan Hayes nodded thoughtfully, acknowledging the validity of the concern. That's a fair point, Tim, he said. And I'm not asking you to sacrifice your livelihoods. That's why we're introducing a new commission system. The room grew silent, every pair of eyes fixed on Nathan as he continued. From now on, bonuses will be based on customer satisfaction, not just sales volume. If you treat customers fairly, you'll still make money, and in fact, you might even make more. A ripple of surprise moved through the employees, their faces a mix of curiosity and disbelief. This approach was unheard of in their world, a radical departure from the high-pressure tactics they had relied on for years. Chris, the young salesman who had been the first to speak out earlier, leaned forward, his eyes wide with realization. "That's actually smart," he admitted, a hint of awe in his voice. Nathan allowed a small, knowing smile to spread across his face. "I know," he said with a light chuckle. "It's almost like I've done this before." The room erupted in quiet laughter, a collective exhale of tension that had hung heavily over the team since the day began. Nathan could feel the shift, the beginning of something new, a chance to rebuild not just a business but the trust and pride of the people who worked there. Later that afternoon, Nathan called a mandatory customer service review meeting. The employees filed into the staff lounge, the hum of coffee machines filling the room as they settled into their seats. On the table in front of Nathan was a thick file of papers, the edges worn from handling. He picked up the file, holding it up for everyone to see. "This," he said, his voice steady, "is a collection of every customer complaint and negative review our corporate office has received about this dealership over the past year." The employees exchanged uneasy glances. The sheer volume of papers in the file was staggering, a silent testament to the depth of the problem they were about to face. "One by one," Nathan continued, opening the file, "we're going to go through these. We're going to understand what went wrong, and more importantly, we're going to make it right." He began reading aloud, the stories cutting through the room like a cold wind. Customers who had been pressured into deals they couldn't afford. Hidden fees that had blindsided families. Trade-ins that were devalued to the point of insult. Each story was a stark reminder of how far the dealership had strayed from its original mission. "This isn't just about numbers," Nathan said as he looked up from the file. "These are real people. Families. Hard-working individuals who trusted us and were let down. That changes now." The employees sat in silence, the weight of the stories sinking in. Nathan could see the impact in their faces, some ashamed, some determined, and others quietly inspired. This wasn't just a meeting, it was a reckoning. As he closed the file, Nathan looked around the room, meeting each employee's gaze. "We can't change the past," he said, "but we can take responsibility for it. And moving forward we will be better." For the first time in a long time, the air in the room felt lighter, charged with a sense of purpose. Nathan knew there was a long road ahead, but this moment felt like a step in the right direction. A step toward something honest, something real. Nathan Hayes scanned the customer complaints file, his eyes narrowing as he read the details of each story. They were tales of people who had been deceived, ignored, or pressured into deals they didn't fully understand. But one review stopped him cold. The words felt like a punch to the gut. "I came in for a used car and was offered a deal that seemed fair at first. But when I got home, I realized they had added a $1,500 extended warranty I never agreed to. I called back and the manager, Rick, told me it was non-refundable. I feel completely ripped off. I wouldn't recommend this dealership to anyone." Nathan's grip on the paper tightened slightly as he looked up. Chris, the young salesman, sat nearby, his jaw clenched with anger. "That's disgusting," Chris muttered, shaking his head. Tim, the older salesman, let out a heavy sigh. "I remember that sale," he said quietly. "She was a young mother. She didn't have much money to begin with." Nathan's gaze hardened, his resolve sharpening like steel. "Then we're fixing it," he said firmly. He turned to his assistant, who stood nearby, waiting for direction. "I want a list of every customer who was overcharged, misled, or treated unfairly," Nathan instructed. "We're calling them back and making things right." The room fell silent, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone. Chris's eyes widened in surprise. "You're serious?" he asked. Nathan met his gaze without hesitation. "Dead serious." By late afternoon, Nathan was seated at his desk, a phone in hand and a stack of customer files in front of him. The room was quiet, save for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the faint sound of papers shuffling. Nathan dialed a number and waited as the line rang. Finally, a voice answered on the other end. "Hello," a woman said cautiously. "Mrs. Thomas?" Nathan began, his tone warm but purposeful. "This is Nathan Hayes, the owner of Golden Ridge Motors. I'm calling to personally apologize for the way you were treated when you purchased your car from us." There was a pause on the line, followed by a faint, incredulous laugh. Wait, you're the owner? Calling me? Yes, ma'am, Nathan said. I've been reviewing past sales and found that you were charged for an extended warranty you didn't agree to. That was wrong and I'm here to make it right. The line went silent again, and when Mrs. Thomas finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. I never thought I'd hear from anyone about this. I tried to fight it, but no one cared. Nathan leaned forward slightly, his tone resolute. I care. And I want to issue you a full refund for the warranty. You trusted us and we let you down. I'm truly sorry. For the next several hours, Nathan repeated this process, calling customer after customer. Each call was a chance to rebuild trust, to show the community that his dealership wasn't just another business. It was a place where integrity mattered. By the time he hung up the last call, Nathan felt a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. It wasn't just about refunds or apologies, it was about setting a new standard. Chris knocked on the office door, his expression one of cautious optimism. We've already had 3 walk-ins today, he said, grinning. They heard you were fixing bad deals and wanted to see if it was true. Nathan smiled faintly, leaning back in his chair. Good, he said. Let's keep proving it. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the lot, Nathan knew this was just the beginning. The work of rebuilding trust was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, the future of Golden Ridge Motors felt bright. Nathan Hayes dialed the next number, his voice steady as he introduced himself. Hello, Mrs. Taylor? This is Nathan Hayes, the owner of Golden Ridge Motors. I wanted to call and personally apologize for the way you were treated when you bought your car. There was a brief silence on the other end, followed by a disbelieving laugh. Wait, you're the Nathan Hayes? The owner? You're calling me? Yes, ma'am, Nathan replied, his tone warm but sincere. And I'd like to make things right. Another pause followed, but this time Nathan could hear the shift in her voice, the raw emotion bubbling just beneath the surface. She had likely spent months feeling helpless, believing there was no recourse for the injustice she'd endured. To her, this wasn't just about a bad deal, it was a betrayal of trust. Nathan spoke gently but with conviction. I've reviewed your file and I see where we failed you. You were charged for something you didn't agree to and that was wrong. I'm truly sorry and I'd like to refund you in full. Her voice broke slightly as she responded, I never thought anyone at that place cared enough to call me, let alone the owner. Nathan leaned forward, his voice resolute. I care, Mrs. Taylor. And I want you to know that what happened to you won't happen again. We're changing how we do business starting now. The call ended with her heartfelt thanks, and as Nathan hung up the phone, he leaned back in his chair, letting out a long, tired sigh. His body was weary but his heart felt lighter. This wasn't just about correcting financial wrongs, it was about rebuilding something far more valuable: trust. The dealership wasn't perfect, not yet. It was still healing, still learning. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like it was on the right path. A knock on the door broke Nathan's thoughts. Chris stepped in, a grin spreading across his face. You're not going to believe this, he said, his excitement contagious. We just had 3 walk-ins. They said they heard the rumors and wanted to see if it was true, that the owner was actually fixing bad deals. Nathan couldn't help but smile, the first real, unguarded smile he'd felt in days. Good, he said, nodding. Let's keep proving them right. Chris nodded, his enthusiasm clear. I think people are starting to notice. Let's make sure they do, Nathan said, standing and stretching. Tomorrow we open with a new mission. And I'll be right here watching, leading, and making sure no customer is ever treated unfairly again. As the day faded into evening, the energy in the dealership was different. It was no longer weighed down by secrecy or greed, but charged with a quiet determination. Nathan knew the road ahead would be long and challenging, but for the first time, it felt like the team was united in a common purpose. Golden Ridge Motors wasn't just selling cars anymore, it was rebuilding its reputation, one honest deal at a time. The next morning, the atmosphere at Golden Ridge Motors was undeniably different. The weight that had pressed down on the showroom for so long seemed to have lifted, if only partially. The air felt lighter, the energy in the space charged with cautious optimism. But Nathan Hayes knew better than to assume change happened overnight. What had unfolded the day before was a statement, a necessary shakeup. Today, however, was the first real test. Nathan arrived earlier than usual, parking his car across the street to observe. He sat quietly, sipping his coffee as employees began trickling into the showroom. Some moved with a newfound determination, their heads high as though ready to embrace the shift. Others, however, walked in slower, their expressions cautious, unsure of what these changes truly meant for them. Nathan watched it all, taking mental notes. Would they adapt to this new way of doing business? Or would some resist, trying to find ways to cling to the old, broken system? He didn't expect perfection. What he did expect was growth. With a deep breath, Nathan stepped out of his car and crossed the street. As he entered the showroom, the familiar sounds of keyboards tapping and light conversation greeted him. The tension wasn't completely gone, but it was muted, replaced by a tentative hope. Chris, the young salesman who had been the first to speak up against Rick, was already at his desk, arranging papers and logging into his system. He glanced up and grinned when he saw Nathan. "Morning, boss." Nathan chuckled, shaking his head. "You don't have to call me that." Chris smirked. "Well, it's better than, 'Hey, mysterious guy who pretended to be a customer.'" Nathan laughed, the sound genuine and unguarded. "Fair point," he admitted, the corner of his mouth lifting in a small smile. As they exchanged the playful banter, Tim, the older salesman, approached, his demeanor thoughtful but lighter than the day before. "Morning, Mr. Hayes," Tim said, offering a nod. His voice carried a tone of reflection. "You really meant what you said yesterday, didn't you?" Nathan turned to him, his expression steady and sincere. "Every word," he said simply. Tim exhaled deeply, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "Well," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips, "I think we might actually pull this off." Nathan placed a reassuring hand on Tim's shoulder. "We will," he said confidently. "But it's going to take all of us." As the morning unfolded, Nathan continued to move through the dealership, greeting employees, answering questions, and offering quiet encouragement. He knew the road ahead would be rocky, but today felt like a step in the right direction. The change was fragile, but it was real. For the first time in a long time, Golden Ridge Motors felt like it was on the cusp of becoming what Nathan had always envisioned. A place where trust wasn't just an afterthought, but the foundation of everything they did. Tim's expression was thoughtful as he glanced at Nathan, his voice quieter now. "You really meant everything you said yesterday, didn't you?" Nathan nodded without hesitation. "Every word." Tim sighed, a deep, weary sound that carried years of unspoken conflict. "Then I guess I owe you an apology." Nathan tilted his head slightly, curiosity flickering in his gaze. "For what?" Tim hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck as he searched for the right words. "For standing by and letting Rick run this place the way he did," he admitted, his tone heavy with regret. "I saw a lot of things I didn't agree with, but I needed the job. I told myself it wasn't my place to question it." Nathan respected the honesty, seeing the weight Tim had carried for far too long. "You're here now doing the right thing," Nathan said, his voice steady and reassuring. "That's what matters." Tim gave a small nod, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. For the first time, it felt like he wasn't just an observer to change but a part of it. As they spoke, the sound of the showroom doors opening drew Nathan's attention. He turned, his eyebrows lifting in surprise as a familiar couple stepped inside. Harold and Linda Carter, the elderly couple from yesterday, entered the dealership. Linda's eyes sparkled as she looked around, her gaze lingering on the showroom as if seeing it in an entirely new light. Harold, meanwhile, moved with purpose, his usual cautious demeanor replaced by something stronger, determination. Nathan immediately crossed the room, a warm smile spreading across his face. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter?" He greeted them, his tone welcoming. "I wasn't expecting to see you back so soon." Harold extended a hand and Nathan shook it firmly. "We wanted to thank you," Harold said, his voice steady but carrying a deep emotional undertone. Linda nodded, her eyes welling up with gratitude. "Not just for what you did for us," she said, her voice soft but clear, "but for what you're doing here. We heard what happened after we left, how you're changing things." Nathan looked between them, humbled by their words. "I'm just doing what I should have been doing all along," he said honestly. Harold shook his head, his grip on Nathan's hand tightening slightly. "You're doing more than that," he said. "You're making things right." Linda added, her voice full of warmth, "Word spreads fast in a town like this, Mr. Hayes. People are already talking about how you stood up for us and how you're making this place better. It's not just about us, you're giving everyone hope." Nathan's chest tightened, their words a reminder of the broader impact of his actions. This wasn't just about saving a dealership, it was about rebuilding trust, one step at a time. "Thank you for saying that," Nathan said sincerely. "It means a lot coming from you." Harold gave a small smile, and Linda reached out to place a gentle hand on Nathan's arm. "You're doing the right thing," she said. "And that matters more than you know." As they continued to talk, Nathan felt a renewed sense of purpose. Seeing the Carters walk into the dealership with hope, rather than hesitation, was a powerful reminder of why he was fighting so hard to change the culture. This wasn't just about fixing mistakes, it was about creating something worth believing in. Harold's voice was steady, carrying the weight of gratitude and purpose. "We wanted to thank you," he said, looking Nathan Hayes directly in the eye. "Not just for what you did for us but for what you're doing here." Nathan blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the sincerity in Harold's tone. Before he could respond, Linda added with a soft smile, "Word spreads fast in this town, Mr. Hayes. People are already talking about how you stood up for us, how you fired that awful man, and how you're making things right. We're not the only ones who were mistreated." Nathan felt a slow but powerful realization settle over him, like the turning of a tide. This wasn't just about fixing one bad deal or one broken system, it was about something much bigger. The entire community had been impacted by what had gone wrong at Golden Ridge Motors, and now they were watching to see if this change was real. As Harold finished speaking, the glass doors swung open again, the chime breaking the momentary silence. A young woman in her mid-30s stepped inside, her expression a mixture of frustration and tentative hope. She clutched a folder of papers tightly against her chest, as though they were precious evidence in a case she'd been fighting far too long. One of the receptionists approached her, but before they could speak, the woman's eyes locked onto Nathan. "Are you the owner?" she asked, her voice firm but edged with hesitation. Nathan stepped forward, his demeanor calm but attentive. "Yes," he said, nodding. "How can I help you?" The woman exhaled sharply, her grip tightening on the folder. "My name is Rebecca Sanders," she said, stepping closer. "Last year, I bought a used car from this dealership, a Ford Explorer." Nathan motioned toward a nearby seating area, his tone steady but inviting. "Please have a seat," he said. "Go on." Rebecca hesitated for a moment before sitting down, the tension in her shoulders clear as she placed the folder carefully on the table between them. "When I bought the car," she began, "the salesman told me it was a great deal. He said the financing was affordable and everything seemed fine at first. But when I got home and reviewed the paperwork, I realized—" Her voice wavered slightly as she opened the folder and pulled out the documents. "They added fees I never agreed to, over $2,000 worth. When I called back, the manager at the time, Rick Larson, told me it was too late to change anything. He said it was non-refundable." Nathan's jaw tightened, though he kept his expression composed. Rebecca's voice grew firmer as she continued, the frustration she had carried for months bubbling to the surface. "I've been stuck paying for something I never wanted and no one would listen to me. I didn't know what else to do, but then I heard about what you did for that couple yesterday, and—" She trailed off, her gaze searching his face for sincerity. "I thought maybe you'd listen." Nathan nodded, his voice steady as he responded. "You were right to come here," he said. "I'm sorry for what happened to you, Rebecca, and I promise we'll make this right." Her eyes widened slightly, as though she hadn't expected such a straightforward response. "You will?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. Nathan met her gaze without hesitation. "Yes. Let me review your file and see exactly what happened. I'll make sure those charges are refunded, and we'll adjust your financing to what it should have been from the start." The room fell silent for a moment as Rebecca processed his words. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded them in her lap. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't think anyone cared." Nathan leaned forward slightly, his tone sincere. "I care. And I'll personally ensure this is resolved." As Rebecca's shoulders relaxed for the first time, Nathan glanced around the room, aware of the employees who were quietly observing. This was the change he had promised. One act of integrity at a time, rebuilding trust and showing the community that Golden Ridge Motors was not the place it had once been. And with every story like Rebecca's, Nathan felt the dealership taking one more step toward becoming the business he had always envisioned. One that valued people over profits and integrity over shortcuts. Rebecca's voice trembled as she pressed on, her frustration spilling into each word. "The salesman told me I was getting a good deal," she said. "He said the financing would be affordable. But when I got home and went through the paperwork, I realized they had added fees I never agreed to." Nathan Hayes' jaw tightened, his frustration growing with every word. This was precisely the kind of deceitful behavior Rick had encouraged, and it made his stomach churn. Rebecca continued, her tone hardening as she recounted her ordeal. "I tried calling back but I kept getting the runaround. They told me it was too late to change anything. In the end, I ended up paying almost $3,000 more than I expected." A ripple of discomfort passed through the employees in the room. A few shifted uneasily in their seats, their expressions betraying that they'd heard complaints like this before, and likely had done little to address them. Nathan took a steadying breath and met Rebecca's gaze. "I'm sorry that happened to you," he said sincerely. Rebecca studied his face, her eyes narrowing slightly as though searching for any trace of dishonesty. She had clearly been lied to before and her trust was thin. "That's not enough," she said, her voice firm. "I don't want an apology. I want to know what you're going to do about it." Nathan didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward, his expression resolute. "Let's pull up your file and see exactly what happened." Rebecca's eyes widened in surprise. "Just like that?" she asked as though waiting for the catch. "Just like that," Nathan replied, his voice steady. Rebecca hesitated, then nodded, her grip on the folder easing slightly as she sat down. Nathan gestured to Chris, who immediately moved to a nearby computer and began pulling up Rebecca's file. Within moments, the screen displayed the numbers, clear as day. Nathan scanned the details, his jaw tightening further. The numbers confirmed Rebecca's story. The fees had been added without her consent, inflating her costs far beyond what she had agreed to. Chris glanced at Nathan, his voice cautious but firm. "It's all here," he said. They added extended warranties, service plans, things she clearly didn't approve. Rebecca folded her arms, her face a mixture of relief and frustration. "I knew it," she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. Nathan turned back to her, his tone resolute. "Rebecca, you were wronged. We'll remove every one of those fees, recalculate your financing, and issue you a refund for the overcharges." For a moment, Rebecca sat in stunned silence, as though she hadn't expected anyone to take her seriously. "You mean it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathan nodded. "I mean it." Her expression softened, the tension in her shoulders easing for the first time. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking slightly. I didn't think anyone would ever care." Nathan leaned back slightly, offering her a reassuring smile. "We care. And I promise you, things will be different here from now on." As the tension in the room dissipated, Nathan glanced around at his employees. They had witnessed the exchange and he could see the subtle shifts in their expressions. Some looked thoughtful, others almost relieved as though this moment marked a new chapter for them too. "Let's make this right," Nathan said, addressing both Rebecca and his team. This wasn't just about fixing one mistake, it was about setting a precedent for how Golden Ridge Motors would operate moving forward. Nathan Hayes exhaled slowly, his eyes scanning the details of Rebecca's contract. It was exactly as she had described. Unnecessary fees tacked on without her knowledge and financing terms inflated far beyond what had been promised. His jaw tightened as he handed the file back to Chris, whose frown deepened as he glanced over the document. "Sir," Chris said hesitantly, "this contract was written by Rick." Nathan nodded, unsurprised. The tactics were all too familiar. His eyes shifted to Rebecca, who sat with her arms crossed, a mixture of anger and wariness etched on her face. Nathan leaned forward, his voice steady as he met her gaze. "We're fixing it?" Rebecca blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Excuse me?" Nathan tapped the contract on the table, his tone resolute. "You were overcharged. That's unethical and I won't allow it." Turning to Chris, Nathan gave clear instructions. "I want every additional charge removed. Calculate exactly what she overpaid and issue her a refund immediately." The room fell into stunned silence. Employees and a few lingering customers had stopped what they were doing, their attention drawn to the exchange. Rebecca stared at Nathan, her breath catching in disbelief. "You're serious?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. Nathan nodded without hesitation. "Completely." For a moment, Rebecca didn't speak, her emotions written plainly across her face. Her eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "I thought I'd never get my money back." Nathan offered a small, genuine smile. "Today we changed that." Rebecca stood a little straighter as Chris handed her a check, the amount reflecting every dollar she'd been wrongfully charged. She clutched it tightly, gratitude and relief washing over her. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You have no idea what this means to me." Nathan nodded. "We're glad to make it right." As Rebecca walked toward the door, check in hand, her face lit with gratitude, Nathan noticed something remarkable. Customers in the showroom, who had been pretending not to listen, were now openly watching. Their hushed conversations filled the space, whispers spreading like wildfire. "Did you see that?" one customer murmured. "He actually gave her a refund." "I've never seen a dealership do that before," another said, his tone tinged with cautious amazement. "Maybe this place really is different now," someone else added. Nathan stood still, taking it all in. This was more than a single act of restitution. It was a ripple that could become a wave. For too long, Golden Ridge Motors had operated under a shadow of mistrust. Today, a spark of something new had been ignited. A belief that honesty and integrity weren't just slogans but principles the dealership was willing to act on. As Nathan turned back to his team, he saw a shift in their expressions. Employees who had once seemed skeptical now looked intrigued, even inspired. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but moments like this proved it was possible. Today wasn't just about fixing Rebecca's contract. It was about showing everyone, customers, employees, and the community, that Golden Ridge Motors was committed to being better. And that commitment was just beginning. Nathan Hayes turned his attention to Chris and Tim, noting their reactions. Chris looked proud, his expression bright with a sense of validation for having spoken up and helped initiate the change. Tim, on the other hand, appeared deep in thought, his brow furrowed as he processed the unfolding transformation. Nathan offered a small, reassuring smile. This wasn't just about issuing one refund, it was about something far bigger. This is about trust, he thought to himself. And trust, once earned, had the power to change everything. The next few days at Golden Ridge Motors felt like the dawn of a new era. With Rick Larson gone, the dealership began to operate on a foundation of honesty and fairness. Customers were being treated with respect, free from the aggressive tactics and hidden fees that had plagued the business in the past. Employees adjusted to the new policies, some embracing the change wholeheartedly, while others remained skeptical, unsure if it would last. But one thing was undeniable. Word was spreading fast. The morning after Nathan issued Rebecca's refund, he arrived at the dealership early. The crisp air carried a sense of quiet anticipation as he parked his car across the street. But as he approached the building, something unexpected came into view. A line of customers stretched outside the door, their faces a mix of curiosity and hope. Nathan paused, momentarily taken aback by the sight. These were people who had heard the rumors, that Golden Ridge Motors was righting its wrongs, that the owner himself was making things right. As the sun rose higher in the sky, the line grew longer. By the time the dealership officially opened, the phones were ringing off the hook, with calls pouring in from customers eager to know if their past deals could be reviewed. Inside, the team worked diligently to address the influx of customers and inquiries. Chris, the young salesman, moved with renewed energy, greeting customers warmly and assisting wherever he could. At one point, he approached Nathan, his face lit with a combination of pride and awe. "Boss," Chris said, gesturing toward the bustling showroom and the growing line of customers outside. "I think we just started something bigger than we realized." Nathan looked around, taking in the vibrant energy of the dealership. Employees were engaged, customers were talking, and for the first time in years, the air felt alive with possibility. He smiled, his confidence unwavering. "That was the goal," he replied simply. Nathan knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long, and not everyone would believe in the changes right away. But for now, the signs were clear. The community was watching, listening, and beginning to trust again. Golden Ridge Motors was on the path to redemption, one honest interaction at a time. And as Nathan stood amidst the activity, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a commitment to proving day by day that this place really was different now. While Golden Ridge Motors was experiencing a resurgence, someone else was taking notice, and they weren't pleased. By lunchtime, Nathan Hayes received an unexpected call. The name on his office phone's display made his brow lift slightly. Michael Langford. Langford was the owner of Langford Motors, a competing dealership in the neighboring town. For years, Langford Motors had been one of Golden Ridge's fiercest rivals. Unlike Nathan, who had built his business on a foundation of fairness and customer satisfaction, Langford had cultivated his success through slick marketing, aggressive sales tactics, and cutthroat pricing. Now, it seemed, Nathan's recent changes had gotten under Langford's skin. Nathan picked up the phone, leaning back in his chair as he answered, "Langford, what can I do for you?" Langford's voice was smooth but carried a distinct edge of tension. "I've been hearing about what you're doing, Hayes," he said, his tone deceptively calm. Nathan smirked, already sensing where the conversation was headed. And I'm warning you," Langford snapped, the smoothness in his voice giving way to frustration. "You're setting a dangerous precedent." Nathan's smile didn't waver. "A dangerous precedent?" he repeated, feigning innocence. Langford's tone sharpened further, his irritation becoming more apparent. "Refunding people? Giving them fair deals? Do you really think it stops there? This industry doesn't work like that." Nathan chuckled softly, his tone relaxed but pointed. "No, Langford. It works by taking advantage of people. That's the industry you're describing. And I'm done with it." There was a pause on the line, followed by a low chuckle from Langford, though it carried no humor. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you?" he said, his words laced with disdain. "News flash, Hayes, this isn't a charity. People don't buy cars because they trust you. They buy from the place that looks the cheapest on paper." Nathan's smirk faded slightly, his voice cooling. "Maybe that's how you run your business," he said evenly. "But I've got a different vision." Langford sighed, the sound heavy with exasperation. "You really think this is going to work? That customers are going to reward you for playing the good guy? It might look good now, but wait until your bottom line starts to bleed." Nathan sat up slightly, his voice firm. "I guess we'll see, won't we?" Langford's frustration bubbled over, his tone turning sharp. "You're not just hurting yourself, Hayes. You're making things harder for the rest of us. If you keep this up, you're going to throw the whole market out of balance." Nathan's response was calm but unyielding. "Or maybe I'm just reminding people that they deserve better." Langford's voice dropped, icy and venomous. "This is a mistake, Hayes. And when it falls apart, don't say I didn't warn you." Nathan let the silence stretch for a moment before responding. "Thanks for the concern, Langford," he said dryly. "But I think I'll take my chances." Langford hung up with an audible click, leaving Nathan to sit back in his chair, a faint smile returning to his lips. The conversation only solidified what he already knew. His changes were making waves not just for his dealership but for the industry around him. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but Nathan was ready to prove that integrity wasn't just good for business, it was the right way to do business. Nathan Hayes tightened his grip on the phone, his jaw clenching as Michael Langford's voice continued to spill its venom. "People don't buy cars because they trust you," Langford said smugly. "They buy from the place that gives them the best deal on paper." Nathan's tone stayed steady, though a simmering anger underpinned his words. "Maybe that's how you do business, Langford." "I don't." Langford sighed dramatically as though Nathan's response amused him. "Fine, be the good guy," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But don't expect it to last. Sooner or later, the bottom line will catch up with you." Nathan's patience snapped. "Are you calling to threaten me, Langford? Because I've got a busy day actually helping customers?" Langford chuckled, the sound low and mocking. "No, Hayes," he said. "I'm calling to let you know that I'm coming for your customers. If you think I'm just going to let you steal the spotlight, you're dead wrong." The line went dead, the final click reverberating in Nathan's ear. He slowly placed the phone down, his mind racing. Langford wasn't bluffing. The man was known for his ruthless tactics, and it wouldn't take long for him to retaliate. By mid-afternoon, the first signs of Langford's counterattack were evident. Chris burst into Nathan's office, his face flushed with urgency. "Sir, we've got a problem," Chris said, his voice hurried. Nathan looked up sharply. "What is it?" Chris hesitated, clearly uneasy about delivering the news. "Customers are leaving?" Nathan frowned, his chest tightening. "Why?" Chris exhaled heavily, the frustration evident in his tone. "Langford's undercutting every deal we offer. He's calling our customers and offering them better prices before they even finalize with us." Nathan's hands tightened into fists as he stood, his resolve hardening. "Show me," he said. He stepped into the showroom, scanning the space. Sure enough, the activity felt different. A middle-aged couple stood at a desk with Tim, the older salesman, their expressions tinged with hesitation. Nathan approached just in time to hear the man say, "We appreciate the offer, but Langford Motors just called. They're offering the same car for $2,000 less." Tim looked frustrated but kept his tone measured. "I understand, but we've given you the best deal we can." The man shrugged apologetically. "We'd love to buy here, but that's a lot of money to pass up." Nathan stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "May I ask you something?" The couple turned to him, surprised but willing to listen. "Did Langford tell you how they're making up for that discount?" Nathan asked. The man frowned. "What do you mean?" Nathan leaned in slightly, his tone serious but conversational. "Did they mention the hidden fees? The financing tricks? The mandatory warranty add-ons they'll push at the last minute?" The couple exchanged a glance, their confidence wavering. "They didn't mention any of that," the woman admitted cautiously. "They won't," Nathan said, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "Because that's how they operate. They lure you in with a lower price, but when you sit down to sign, suddenly the deal isn't what they promised." Tim chimed in, pulling up a document on his computer. "We've had multiple customers come back to us after being burned by Langford. They thought they were getting a better deal, but when they saw the final paperwork..." He trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. The couple looked at each other again, then back at Nathan. The man nodded slowly. "We'll stick with you." Nathan smiled. That's a smart choice. As the couple finalized their paperwork, Nathan turned to Chris, his expression resolute. Langford's not just coming after us, he's trying to destroy everything we're building. Chris nodded grimly. So what do we do? Nathan's jaw tightened. We fight back, but not by stooping to his level. We show people who we are and why we're better. And we make sure Langford's tactics don't go unnoticed. This wasn't just a business rivalry anymore, it was a battle for trust, integrity, and the future of how people were treated in the industry. Nathan knew the stakes and he wasn't about to back down. Nathan Hayes stood nearby, listening intently as a middle-aged couple spoke with Tim at the desk. The man's tone was polite but hesitant. We appreciate the offer, he said, but we just got a call from Langford Motors. They're offering the same car for $2,000 less. Tim's frustration was evident, though he kept his voice professional. We've given you the best deal we can, he replied, trying to maintain the couple's trust. The man shrugged, glancing at his wife. We'd love to buy here, but that's a lot of money to pass up. Nathan felt his pulse quicken. Langford was doing exactly what he had threatened, luring customers away with lowball offers designed to undercut without disclosing the hidden costs. Nathan knew he couldn't let this slide. Stepping forward, he addressed the couple directly, his tone calm but commanding. Excuse me, he said. May I ask you something? The man turned to him, curiosity flickering across his face. Of course. Did Langford tell you how they're making up for that discount? Nathan asked. The man blinked, his brow furrowing. What do you mean? Nathan leaned in slightly, his voice steady and direct. Did they mention the hidden fees? The financing tricks? The mandatory warranty add-ons they'll push at the last minute? The man's expression shifted, his confidence faltering as his wife glanced at him, concern in her eyes. No, the man admitted. They didn't mention any of that. Nathan nodded knowingly. That's because they don't want you to know, he said. They lure you in with a lower price, but when you sit down to sign the paperwork, suddenly the deal isn't what they promised. Tim, sensing the couple's doubt, pulled up a document on his computer. Take a look here, he said, turning the screen toward them. We've had multiple customers come back to us after going to Langford. They thought they were getting a better deal, but when they saw the final paperwork, he trailed off, allowing the data to speak for itself. The screen displayed a series of complaints from former Langford customers, stories of inflated financing terms, hidden fees, and last-minute add-ons that had turned supposed bargains into costly mistakes. The couple exchanged a long look, their doubt now clearly growing. The man sighed, shaking his head slightly. I didn't think about that. His wife touched his arm, her voice soft but firm. Maybe we should stay here. I don't want any surprises. Nathan smiled gently. You won't have any with us, he said. What we offer is exactly what you'll get. No tricks, no hidden costs. The man nodded, his decision made. All right, he said, offering a small smile. We'll stick with you. Nathan stepped back as Tim finalized the paperwork, his chest easing with a sense of quiet satisfaction. This was more than just one sale, it was proof that honesty and transparency could compete against underhanded tactics. As Nathan turned to leave, he caught Chris's eye from across the room. The younger salesman gave him a subtle thumbs up, a quiet acknowledgement of the victory. Nathan returned the gesture with a small nod, his mind already turning to the next step. Langford was playing dirty, but Nathan wasn't worried. Golden Ridge Motors had something Langford didn't, integrity. And that, Nathan believed, would make all the difference. As the couple finalized their decision, the man nodded firmly. We'll stick with you guys, he said, his tone resolute. Nathan Hayes smiled, his expression warm but purposeful. That's a smart choice, he said, knowing they had just made a decision based on trust, not empty promises. That evening, as the last light faded and the dealership closed for the day, Nathan gathered his team in the staff lounge. The energy in the room was a mix of exhaustion and determination, everyone still processing the challenges of the day. Langford is trying to kill our momentum, Nathan began, his voice calm but firm. And he's using price as a weapon. Chris frowned, his arms crossed as he leaned against the wall. So what do we do? Drop our prices even lower? Nathan shook his head immediately. No, he said. We don't play dirty, we play smart. He turned to Tim, the older salesman who was seated near the front. Tim, I want you to pull up a list of every customer who's left a negative review about Langford Motors in the past 2 years. Tim's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Why? He asked, his curiosity tinged with skepticism. Nathan smirked faintly, the glint of a plan in his eyes. We're going to remind people what Langford really stands for. The next morning, Golden Ridge Motors launched a bold campaign. Personalized emails and social media messages were sent to customers who had left negative reviews about Langford Motors, targeting those who had experienced firsthand the deception and hidden costs Langford was known for. The message was simple and direct. Were you misled by Langford Motors? Bring your paperwork to Golden Ridge Motors and we'll review it for free. No tricks, no hidden fees, just honesty. Within hours, the first few customers began to arrive. Some came with stacks of paperwork, others with stories of frustration and regret. Each one was greeted with respect and understanding. The promise of fairness wasn't just marketing, it was a commitment Nathan and his team were ready to honor. By midday, the campaign was gaining traction. Calls poured in, and social media buzzed with stories of customers who had found relief and justice at Golden Ridge Motors. For many, it wasn't just about fixing a bad deal, it was about finding a place where they felt valued and respected. Chris approached Nathan during the lunch rush, his expression a mix of amazement and pride. "Boss," he said, gesturing to the busy showroom. "It's working. People are coming back to us?" Nathan nodded, a small but confident smile playing on his lips. "Good," he said. "Let's keep proving them right." Golden Ridge Motors wasn't just surviving the storm, it was turning the tide. Langford Motors might have used price as a weapon, but Nathan was wielding something far more powerful: trust. And in the long run, trust would prove to be the stronger force. By midday, Golden Ridge Motors was buzzing with activity. The campaign had worked. Customers arrived in droves carrying paperwork, frustration, and hope. By evening, the trickle of people had turned into a flood. Some customers had been overcharged by Langford Motors, their contracts riddled with hidden fees. Others had been forced into bad financing deals with inflated interest rates. Many had been tricked into purchasing unnecessary add-ons they didn't want or need. Each of them was furious, eager to share their stories and desperate for a dealership they could trust. Nathan Hayes and his team worked tirelessly, sitting down with each customer, reviewing their paperwork, and helping to rectify the damage Langford Motors had caused. Refunds were issued, financing terms were renegotiated, and for the first time in a long time, these customers felt heard and valued. By the end of the week, Langford Motors was in turmoil. Angry calls flooded their office lines, scathing reviews littered their social media pages, and frustrated customers demanded answers. Langford's staff, once confident in their boss's tactics, now scrambled to contain the damage. Then late one afternoon, Nathan's office phone rang. He recognized the number immediately: Michael Langford. Nathan picked up the receiver, his voice steady. "Langford." This time, Langford's voice wasn't smooth or mocking. It was sharp, laced with anger and desperation. "You think you won, Hayes?" Langford spat. "You're ruining me." Nathan leaned back in his chair, his tone calm and unwavering. "No, Langford," he said. "You ruined yourself." With that, Nathan hung up the phone, ending the conversation as decisively as he had ended the toxic practices at his own dealership. The air inside Golden Ridge Motors buzzed with energy. For the past week, customers had poured in, eager to escape Langford Motors' deceptive practices and find a dealership that operated with integrity. What once seemed like an impossible task, restoring Golden Ridge Motors' damaged reputation, was happening faster than anyone could have predicted. Customers were talking, the community was listening, and the tide was turning. Nathan should have been celebrating. By all accounts, the changes he'd implemented were working, and the dealership was thriving. But instead he found himself waiting. He knew Langford too well to believe this was over. Langford wasn't the type to back down quietly, and Nathan suspected his rival was already plotting his next move. That suspicion was confirmed later that afternoon. The showroom doors swung open with a forceful clang, and in walked Langford himself, flanked by two of his top sales managers. His pristine suit was slightly disheveled, and his face, usually smug, was tight with frustration. The employees at Golden Ridge Motors paused what they were doing, their eyes flicking to Nathan. Nathan stood, his expression calm but his posture firm as Langford strode toward him. The confrontation was inevitable and Nathan was ready. This wasn't just about two businesses, it was a clash of values. And Nathan wasn't going to let Langford's tactics undermine the trust he was building. The doors of Golden Ridge Motors swung open with a loud thud, drawing the attention of everyone in the showroom. Michael Langford stormed in, flanked by two of his top sales managers. His usually pristine suit was rumpled, his tie slightly askew, and his face, typically smug and self-assured, was tight with visible frustration. Nathan Hayes, standing near the front desk, didn't move. He simply folded his arms across his chest, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Langford's charged entrance. "Langford," Nathan said evenly. Langford forced a smirk, though it lacked his usual bravado. "Hayes," he replied, his tone dripping with faux cheer. "I figured I'd come to congratulate you. Looks like you're enjoying your little victory." Nathan tilted his head slightly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Little victory? You mean restoring honesty to my business?" "Yeah," he said, his voice steady, "I'd say it's a big one." Langford let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking his head as he took a step closer. "You really think this is sustainable?" he asked, his voice rising slightly. "Giving out refunds, canceling fees, playing the good guy? That's not how dealerships survive. Eventually, your numbers are going to drop and your people are going to turn on you." Nathan met Langford's gaze without flinching. "My people are with me," he said, his voice firm and resolute. "Not because of numbers but because they believe in what we're building. That's why we're winning." Langford's jaw tightened, his forced smirk falling away as his frustration bubbled to the surface. "You don't get it, do you?" he spat. "You embarrassed me, made a fool of my business." Nathan's expression didn't waver. "You did that to yourself," he replied, his tone calm but cutting. "You built your business on deceit and exploitation. People are just seeing it for what it is." Langford's eyes narrowed and he stepped closer, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "You should have stayed in your lane, Hayes. You think you're fixing things but you're just setting yourself up to fail." Nathan stood his ground, his posture unwavering. "Maybe," he said. "But at least I'll fail doing the right thing." The tension in the room was thick, every employee and customer frozen in place, watching the confrontation unfold. Langford's fists clenched at his sides, but after a long, tense silence he turned on his heel, motioning for his managers to follow him. As Langford stormed out, the showroom buzzed with whispers. Nathan remained where he was, exhaling slowly as the adrenaline ebbed. This wasn't just about Langford's anger or even the competition. It was about proving that honesty and integrity could thrive in an industry so often dominated by greed. Nathan turned to his employees, his expression resolute. "This is why we keep going," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "Not for him, not for competition, but for the people who walk through those doors every day trusting us to treat them fairly." The employees nodded, some with newfound determination, others with quiet relief. Nathan knew the battle with Langford wasn't over, but as he looked around the room, he felt confident that Golden Ridge Motors was ready for whatever came next. Nathan Hayes's eyes darkened, his gaze unwavering as Langford's anger flared. Langford leaned in slightly, his voice lowering to a venomous whisper. "You should have stayed in your lane, Hayes." Nathan remained still, his expression calm but resolute. "Are you threatening me, Langford?" he asked, his voice carrying a steady authority. A tense silence followed, the air thick with unspoken tension. Langford's fingers twitched at his sides, his frustration bubbling to the surface. For a moment, it seemed like he might lose control entirely, but instead he straightened, forcing himself to step back. He wasn't used to losing, and the sting of it was etched into every line of his face. Nathan didn't flinch. He stood rooted, a quiet yet commanding presence as Langford stormed out of the dealership, leaving behind an atmosphere crackling with unease. But Nathan knew better than to think the confrontation was over. Langford wasn't the type to walk away without a parting shot. Later that evening, just before closing, the first signs of Langford's retaliation emerged. Chris burst into Nathan's office, his face pale, his breath hurried. "Boss," he said, holding up his phone. "You're not going to believe this." Nathan stood immediately, the urgency in Chris's tone putting him on edge. "What happened?" Chris handed him the phone, the screen lit with a news headline. "Langford Motors exposes Golden Ridge Motors refund scam." Nathan's eyes narrowed as he read the accompanying story. The article detailed an interview with Michael Langford, who claimed that Golden Ridge Motors was misleading the public by offering selective refunds to cover up its past dishonest sales practices. Langford went on to allege that Nathan's dealership was hemorrhaging money and would soon be forced to close its doors. Nathan tightened his grip on the phone, his jaw clenching. It was a blatant attempt to spin the truth, to paint Golden Ridge Motors as the villain and discredit everything Nathan and his team had worked to rebuild. Chris shook his head, his frustration evident. "People are already talking about it," he said. "Some are asking if it's true, if we're really in trouble." Nathan exhaled slowly, his mind racing. Langford wasn't just trying to damage Golden Ridge Motors' reputation. He was trying to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of their customers and the community. Nathan could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but he refused to let it rattle him. He placed the phone down on his desk and met Chris's concerned gaze. "We're not going to let this stand," Nathan said firmly. "Call the team. First thing tomorrow we're addressing this head-on." Chris nodded, his determination returning as he left to prepare for the next day. Nathan sat back in his chair, his jaw set. Langford's tactics were underhanded, but Nathan had learned long ago that the best way to combat lies was with the truth. The next morning would bring a new battle, but Nathan was ready. This wasn't just about defending his business, it was about proving that integrity, once established, could withstand even the most calculated attacks. As the fallout from Michael Langford's smear campaign rippled through the community, Nathan Hayes sat in his office, listening as Chris relayed the latest updates. "Some customers are second-guessing us," Chris said, frustration laced in his tone. "They think this whole thing is just a marketing stunt." Nathan set his jaw, his eyes hardening. Langford had played his final, desperate card. Now it was time to end this. The next morning, Nathan called for a press conference. The front lot of Golden Ridge Motors was transformed into a makeshift stage, flanked by reporters, customers, and employees. The air buzzed with tension and anticipation, cameras flashing as the crowd murmured among themselves. Nathan stepped forward, his calm and confident presence immediately commanding attention. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady and clear. "I won't waste your time. I'm here to address the accusations made against my dealership." The crowd hushed, the tension palpable as all eyes turned to Nathan. "Michael Langford claims we're running a refund scam. He says we're lying to our customers and that we're on the verge of collapse." Nathan paused deliberately, letting the weight of the words sink in. Then he smiled faintly, his demeanor shifting from serious to resolute. "Langford is right about one thing," he said, his voice ringing out with conviction. "Our business model is different. But it's not a scam, it's called integrity." A murmur rippled through the crowd, the energy shifting as reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks and cameras zoomed in. Nathan continued, his tone unwavering. "I'm not ashamed to say that yes, we refunded customers who were mistreated. Yes, we corrected bad deals. And yes, we took responsibility for the past." He looked directly into the cameras, his gaze steady and piercing. "And we continue to do so." The murmur in the crowd grew louder, a mix of surprise and curiosity as Nathan's words landed. Reporters leaned forward, microphones and notepads at the ready. "I won't apologize for doing what's right," Nathan said. "For too long, businesses in this industry have operated on deception, cutting corners, and exploiting trust. But Golden Ridge Motors isn't just any business. We're committed to earning back the trust of our customers, not through gimmicks or tricks but by being better." Nathan's voice rose slightly, his passion evident. "This isn't about competing with Langford Motors or any other dealership. It's about changing how people are treated when they walk onto a lot. It's about fairness, honesty, and respect." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on his every word. Nathan's employees stood behind him, their faces a mixture of pride and determination. Customers in the audience nodded subtly, some murmuring to each other in agreement. "Langford says we'll fail," Nathan said, his tone steady. "That this model won't last. But I believe differently. I believe that people deserve better. And as long as I'm here, that's exactly what we'll offer." With that, Nathan stepped back, his final words reverberating in the air. The reporters sprang into action, shouting questions as the crowd erupted into a mix of applause and chatter. Nathan turned toward Chris and the rest of his team, his expression calm but determined. "Now," he said quietly, "let's prove it." The press conference wasn't just a defense, it was a declaration of purpose, a commitment to values that Nathan knew would define the future of Golden Ridge Motors. And for the first time, the path forward felt not just possible but unstoppable. Nathan Hayes wasn't on the defensive. Standing tall before the gathered crowd, he leaned into the microphone, his voice calm yet powerful. "Langford Motors wants you to believe that honest business can't survive," he said, meeting the eyes of the reporters and customers before him. "That to make money, we have to deceive customers, manipulate deals, and cut corners." He shook his head firmly. "That's a lie. And we're proving it." Behind him, Chris, Tim, and the rest of the employees stood proudly, their presence a testament to the changes sweeping through Golden Ridge Motors. In the crowd, customers began to clap, the applause growing steadily louder as Nathan's words resonated. Then, something entirely unexpected happened. A man stepped forward from the back of the crowd, his posture tense but determined. He looked to be in his early 40s, wearing a slightly wrinkled dress shirt and slacks. As he moved toward the front, murmurs rippled through the audience. Nathan watched him carefully, his curiosity piqued. The man reached the edge of the makeshift stage, his voice loud and clear as he said, I quit my job at Langford Motors this morning. A wave of surprise swept through the crowd. The reporters turned their cameras and microphones toward the man, who held up a folder of papers, gripping it tightly as though it carried the weight of his confession. Everything you said about Langford Motors is true, the man announced, his voice steady despite the tension in his face. He handed the folder to a nearby reporter, who immediately began flipping through the pages. These are records of the hidden fees they charged customers, the fake discounts, the financing scams. It's all here. The crowd erupted into gasps and murmurs as the weight of the revelation settled over them. Reporters jotted down notes furiously, their cameras flashing as they documented the moment. Nathan felt a surge of satisfaction. Langford's deceit wasn't just being challenged, it was being exposed from within. This wasn't simply a win for Golden Ridge Motors. It was a vindication of everything Nathan had fought for. As the former Langford employee stepped aside, Nathan turned back to the crowd, his voice steady. This isn't just about one dealership or one set of bad practices, he said. This is about demanding better from businesses, better for customers, and better for the community. The crowd broke into applause again, the energy electric. Nathan stepped back, letting the truth of the moment speak louder than any speech he could give. That evening, Golden Ridge Motors was flooded with customers. Some were people who had once doubted the dealership, skeptical of its sudden transformation. Others were those who had been hurt by Langford Motors' practices, seeking a dealership they could finally trust. The shift was undeniable. Golden Ridge Motors wasn't just surviving, it was thriving, built on a foundation of trust, transparency, and a commitment to doing what was right. And as Nathan looked out over the bustling showroom, he felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing they were proving every doubter, every critic, and every cynic wrong. One customer at a time. One honest deal at a time. A year had passed since the tumultuous battle with Langford Motors. Nathan Hayes sat at his desk, gazing out of the large office window at the bustling Golden Ridge Motors dealership. The once fractured business was now thriving, its showroom filled with activity and energy. Sales were up, employees were happier, and most importantly, customers trusted the dealership again. Langford Motors, meanwhile, had not survived the fallout. News outlets had run extensive stories exposing their fraudulent practices, fueled in part by the whistleblower who had stepped forward during Nathan's press conference. Customers had demanded refunds, lawsuits were filed, and within a month, Langford Motors had shut its doors for good. Golden Ridge Motors had emerged from the ordeal stronger than ever. Chris, who had shown remarkable courage and leadership during the transition, had been promoted to sales manager. Tim, the veteran salesman, now trained new hires in ethical sales practices, sharing the hard-earned lessons he had learned over the years. The dealership was no longer just a place to buy cars, it was a symbol of integrity and fairness in the community. Nathan's gaze shifted to his desk, where a letter sat neatly on top of a small stack of papers. The envelope was handwritten, and he immediately recognized the sender, Harold and Linda Carter. He opened it carefully, pulling out a photo of their son's old car, now fully restored to its former glory. Nathan felt his chest tighten as he read the words, a testament to the care and respect that had been given him. At the bottom of the photo, as an effort to handwritten business had grown into something far greater. Thank you for proving that good people still exist in business. Wasn't just about cars or sales anymore. Proud of you. It was about creating a legacy of honesty, of doing right by people, and of building trust that would last for generations. As Nathan placed the letter back on his desk, a small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. For the first time in a long time, he felt a profound sense of peace. This journey had been far from easy, but it had been worth every challenge, every sleepless night, and every confrontation. Because in the end, Nathan had built more than a successful dealership, he had built something truly meaningful. A legacy that was worth more than any sale. A legacy that reminded him why he started this business in the first place. And that, above all else, was his greatest victory. The story of Nathan Hayes and Golden Ridge Motors is not just a journey of an individual striving to correct the wrongs in his business but also a shining example of the value of honesty and the potential for change in society. In real life, it's not uncommon to encounter stories of businesses exploiting customers' lack of knowledge for profit, turning trust into a tool for financial gain. This erodes people's faith in the system and the community around them. However, Nathan's story demonstrates that even in an industry rife with competition and temptations, there is room for ethics and justice. Nathan's actions, confronting Rick Larson or deciding to refund customers who had been misled, are not just business decisions. They are affirmations that doing the right thing is never outdated. In reality, this story resonates with those individuals or organizations that dare to stand up against injustice, even under significant pressure. Movements advocating for consumer rights or businesses committed to transparency in their operations prove that trust is the most valuable asset a company can build. For every person in society, this story serves as a reminder that we all share a responsibility for upholding honesty. Whether as an employee, a business owner, or a customer, protecting fairness and trust forms the foundation for a better community. Ultimately, as the Carter family stated, good people still exist. But it takes courage to stand on the side of what is right. The lesson to take away is that no matter what field you do business in, it is essential to be honest and respect your customers as if they were your own family. By putting the interests and rights of your customers above the trivial calculations of personal gain, you can build a sustainable business that lives on in the hearts of your customers. Thank you for spending your time today on the Soul Deep Stories channel and listening to this story along with the messages we've brought to you through it. I hope you have a wonderful day, and if you have any comments or thoughts to share, please leave them in the comments section below the video. Don't forget to hit like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our next video with more inspiring stories. Soul Deep Stories wishes you all the best and looks forward to seeing you again.